So when they started this protocol, they found out that when people started to reflect on their life and remember who they were, the life they lived, they were able to gain a new insight. They were able to find closure and revisit things that maybe they needed to address again. And after they did this life review and they wrote down what they said and read it back to them, that it actually not only made people feel better, but it decreased their pain and it decreased their anxiety.
This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you.
Legacy. What is it, and why does it matter? As a 28-year veteran in the field of Otorhinolaryngology, clinical nurse specialist Maggie Gannon first encountered the transformational impact of legacy in the crucible of caring for desperately ill head and neck cancer patients. Then, cancer hit close to home. That ordeal galvanized her resolve to bring the power of legacy to everyone. Today, Maggie is the founder and CEO of Haven, the first customer-centric company built from clinical research to help the patient, the family, and the companies that serve them improve quality of life during life's last chapter. Haven is changing the experience of death into something more meaningful and peaceful when the time comes. Maggie is also a recognized national lecturer and author. This is the second time in as many episodes that legacy has come up, so I'm taking note. If you haven't already, tune into episode 75 with Allison Zimmerman for her perspective on legacy. There's something here that we need to pay attention to, because those who have looked mortality square in the eyes say it's important. Let's hear and heed their counsel now, before our own encounter with mortality is upon us. A brief note before we jump into the conversation. My audio quality is much worse in this episode than usual. I didn't discover the technical glitch until after the recording was in the can. I decided to release the episode anyway, because what Maggie has to share is so valuable. My apologies for the less pleasant listening experience. As those in the predestination camp would say, glad I got that over with. All right, let's get to it. Here's my conversation with Maggie Gannon, where we explore what legacy is and why it matters.
Maggie, what are some of the key lessons you've learned about life, death, and dying from your work with chronically and terminally ill cancer patients?
I've learned that as a healthcare professional, it's really important to understand how we treat patients on a daily basis, because oftentimes as people are going through treatment or they're becoming progressively more ill, they lose their sense of self because their choices are taken away. And, with your podcast, it's all about facing your mortality. And there's no better example than a cancer patient, because every day is an opportunity for them to reinvent themselves because they're faced with their mortality. Am I going to live through this disease process? How is this going to affect my life? And I think it's important to remind patients along the way that, even though their circumstances change on a daily basis, that they always can take a step back and regroup and figure out what they do have power over to change. And that's usually their choices and how they're going to react, accept or not accept the situation.
You mentioned that cancer patients in particular have an opportunity to reinvent themselves frequently. And I've never heard it said that way or would have known to have thought of it that way. What does that look like in real time as they're going through, as you said, the disease process?
Well, for instance, the patient population that was near and dear to my heart were our head and neck cancer patients. And they're a very complex and vulnerable patient population. And the reason is because they have different psychosocial issues, just layer upon layer. So usually if somebody was diagnosed with prostate cancer or breast cancer or cancer of the stomach, people would go through treatment and they're walking around in the world and they have a t-shirt on or maybe a hat, but nobody really knows that that person has cancer. But when someone has a head and neck malignancy, they lose their privacy because the whole world sees that their entire face has changed. So these patients have to learn how to accept that, their cancer isn't private anymore and their appearance changes. So reinventing themselves depends on where that disease was located in this region. In this region, the head and neck area, it's the interface of the brain and body, right? So you've got all this noisy anatomy that's complicated. And sometimes these tumors affect the way we breathe, how we breathe. Can we talk anymore? Can we move our tongue? Can we swallow? Can we shrug our shoulders? Can we blink our eyes? Can we move our face? That's a huge game changer, especially if someone's a teacher for a living and now they're going to have to breathe a different way and it's going to affect the way that they speak. Or what kind of therapy is going to result, or what type of therapy are we going to choose to treat their disease? Are we going to go in and take that tumor out? And then taking the tumor out, we're making a big hole in their face. So the way the world sees them is different because we're taking another part of the body and we're doing a free tissue transplant and we're connecting it to a vessel up here, and we're essentially mutilating them. So every day they have to face, what am I going to look like? Do I even want to be seen by my friends and family? And am I going to survive my prognosis? And what's a good day going to look like for me? To really get in with patients and roll your sleeves up and try to think about all their needs and how to meet those needs, and really to understand that by just listening and having empathy and hearing what people need to say and feel, it's very healing for them to know that they're being heard, and it helps them to accept the situation and take a step back and realize that they do have choices. They may not have as many choices as they had the day before, but today I can choose A, B, and C, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And it's hard to fathom being in that position. Of course, any of us could be anytime soon, and have to be dealing with that. I'm curious what attributes in people you saw enabled them to accept and begin to adapt to their new situation day by day as it changed, sometimes pretty rapidly. And then what qualities you saw that prevented people from being able to do so? Because I think there's some even for those of us who aren't experiencing, a really grave cancer battle, each of us has an opportunity on a daily basis to either accept what is and adapt and work with it, or to continue to deny what is and not adapt and work against it. What did you see?
It was all about each person's coping mechanisms and what they brought to the table. Did they have a spirituality, a belief system in place? That was really important, because I felt like regardless of if they, if they had a faith, if they were religious, or if they just had this spirituality that they could tap into, it's like, they're on E and they drive into the gas station and you fill up the tank. That was so helpful to have that spiritual support. And then people with friends and family, they would, because they could rely on having that support network for them. Oftentimes too, even people that had the strong support system and had the spiritual belief system and had this tool belt of, resources, they would go through stages: anger, grief, bargaining, the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. It's the same sort of thing when you're going through cancer treatment. So, I would see sometimes people would be very, very angry. And not only the patients would be angry, but their family members would be really angry because they weren't in a place and couldn't really understand and cope with what their loved one was going through. And what I remember, it's reminding me, like years ago, I was talking with an older woman and her husband, and she was the patient undergoing treatment. And we were talking about, the treatment and resources in God, because she believed she had a very strong faith in God, and talking about how we can bring God in to help. And he became so angry because she started to cry, and he pulled me outside of the room and he said, "You stop making my wife cry." And I was like, oh boy, this is understanding that it's not about me, that this, it doesn't matter who would be in the room, that this is how he was processing everything that was happening to someone that he loved.
When you mentioned that having family and friends around was one of the ways that people were able to accept and adapt to the new situation, it occurred to me that the opposite could also be true. I could imagine that family and friends could be an impediment to them embracing their situation and working with what was.
Yes, that's a very good point. that's why it's really important that we give patients tools to know that they're in charge, and whatever they choose, whatever direction to treat the disease or not to treat disease, to really communicate that among all the family members, because there's been, situations where, children have had different opinions of what mom and dad should do. And it's gotten pretty ugly at the bedside. And, as a support person, as an advocate for patients, it's very important that we all know what the patient's wishes are, and those wishes are communicated amongst everybody so we can support them the way that they need to be supported.
You spent, 25 years and change working with people in these grave situations. How does that affect you? How does that affect your relationship with life? How does it affect the way that you live? How does that affect your relationship to death and dying?
Well, it's profoundly affected me, and it's affected me at different ways in different times of my life. Early on, I would get very upset when a patient would die, and it almost would feel like I lost a friend, because it was very personal to me. And it was an honor and a privilege to be able to, number one, get to know someone, and then, they would die. And for, I guess it took about 5 or 6 years, and I got to the point where I thought, maybe I don't want to do this anymore, because it's so emotionally draining to watch people die. And I sought counsel from a mentor of mine. She was also a clinical nurse specialist. And she said to me, Maggie, it's not about the destination. It's about the journey. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. Like, if this is not about me making sure that they don't die from their disease, it's just being able to show up with someone during one of the most vulnerable places in their life. And that is a gift in and of itself. So once I was able to rotate the other way, even would I still cry if someone died? Yes, because it's important to feel my feelings. And that's part of life. Like, crying it's okay to cry and to grieve. But it was easier because I felt like I did my part, and I tried really hard, and I was able to show up for them just when they needed someone to show up.
It sounds like your objective shifted a little bit. Your intention shifted a little bit in providing care for your patients. That in your earlier years, it was, I'm going to do everything I can to prevent anyone under my care from dying. And then the supervising nurse helped you see that the process is more important than the destination. How did that evolve your goals in working with your patients?
Well, I was able to set more realistic, I guess, expectations. Because, growing up and experiencing death and dying, and I had a lot of people die young with me. And so what I carried into my professional career was a lot of anxiety around losing someone and feeling abandoned. And so that was a lot of leftover feelings that I had when I would take care of my patients. So it really helped me to take a step back and get a perspective and say, wow, this is a way for me to change this experience that brought me so much pain, and to change it in a more meaningful way where I can still show up and be with somebody without feeling abandoned, and just know that I helped along their path.
How did that prolonged exposure to other people's dying and deaths impact your own relationship with your mortality?
I think everything happens for a reason. And I grew up in this little tiny town, and there was an alley behind our backyard, and behind the alley was a cemetery. And I always, I was intrigued with death and dying as a child, and we would actually literally play Ghost in the Graveyard. and I was always fascinated, walking around the cemetery and looking at the tombstones and looking at the dates, like this person would died here and they died here. They only lived 12 years. What happened, and what was their life like? And I would kind of just I wasn't obsessed with it, but it was something that I would do on a day where I didn't have anything to do. I would go over to the cemetery and walk around and look at everything. So it was always, I don't know, like it's just always something that fascinated me. Then when people that I was close with died in my life, kids I went to school with, losing my grandparents, things like that. And once I could step away from the grief part of it, I was fascinated about what happens when you die and things like that. So, but really it got real when I would hold people's hands through this process and then they would actually die. And it would make me realize that, my life could end at any point, and that I was grateful. I was so grateful each and every day to be healthy. And, the things I take for granted, being able to brush my teeth, drink a glass of water, eat a nice meal, exercise, that's a privilege. It's a privilege. And to work with people who've just recently lost that privilege and they have to figure out how they're going to cope with that next step. I felt lucky.
Gratitude. That's so interesting. Makes a lot of sense. So you spent all those years helping others and other families through this process of dying, and ultimately many of them dying. And then it got really personal for you. I mean, not very long ago. What happened?
Well, my husband was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia Memorial Day of 2021. And as you know, we live in Colorado and we love being outdoors, and we were cycling up Vail Pass, and he wasn't feeling as well as he normally would. He was, like it took him a lot longer to get to the top of the climb. And I asked him, I said, "Are you feeling okay?" And he said, maybe I'm getting a sinus infection. And we came home, and I think 2 weeks later, he was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. And it changed everything. I felt like I was hit with a bag of bricks, and everything that I knew before was just wiped away. And all the experience I had taking care of patients and preparing loved ones and family members, to walk through these treatments, it didn't even register, because all I could think about was, what if I lost him? And it was so different putting those shoes on. You always say oh, you never know what it's like until you step in someone else's shoes. Well, that's what happened with me. I had no idea. And it brought everything into a clear, sharp focus about what was really important. And that was being in the moment, every second of every day, of every second I had with him. And even that was with FaceTime, because it was in the middle of the pandemic and there were no visitors allowed. And he spent 8 weeks in a hospital room in isolation. And it changed. I think about how I even got through it, or how he got through it. And I was grateful for the support resources that we had in place, because that's what I had to lean on. The neighbors that brought us meals, having a relationship with my higher power. It was so very important. And all I kept thinking about was, I spent, in between these hospital visits and the trips to the emergency room because of the bleeding or the infection, I just kept thinking, I don't want him to suffer the way that I saw my patients suffer. And I felt bad, because I should have acted sooner with all the other patients that I took care of. I felt horrible inside, because I didn't, I felt like there was something more I could have done to give them dignity, to restore their self-respect, to empower them, regardless of how long they had. And it resulted in, I changed my career, and I developed a legacy platform to help people live their life to their fullest, regardless of how much time they have.
Well, clearly the experience is still very fresh for you emotionally. I mean, that was not very long ago that he began that journey. You guys began that journey. And I can't imagine how brutal that was in the midst of the pandemic, to be isolated in that way. I mean, just you guys felt very painfully every day the absence of human connection and touch
at a time when you needed it most. And that must have been so, so difficult. I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
And he has remarkably weathered that storm. Is that correct?
Yes. He thankfully had a very rare and treatable form, and he's in full remission. And it's been 2 years, over 2 years now.
So you both have been to that frontier where you stare mortality in the face, and you've returned, and you've brought with you treasures of insight and knowledge and wisdom and perspective that those of us that haven't yet done that really need. And so I'm so grateful for this conversation, because it changes my life every time I have these conversations, and it changes our listeners' lives. You mentioned that as you walked through your husband's journey with him, you reflected on the way you'd interacted with your patients. Did I hear that correctly?
Mm-hmm.
And it led you to realize there were ways that you could have been with them differently that you weren't. Will you say more about that? What specifically did you realize in the midst of caring for your husband would have helped your patients?
Well, if I would have had access to or known about, these palliative care or quality of life interventions that help people to maintain their dignity, and the one specifically that I'm referring to is called legacy therapy or dignity therapy. There's probably over close to 500 articles that support legacy or dignity therapy methodology to help anybody who's sick, chronically ill, or healthy to really get perspective of their life and feel better. So with legacy therapy, you do a life review with someone, and they start to reflect on their life. And you can ask your patient, or even, if you want to do this with a family member, you can just say, tell me about what's meaningful to you. What brings you joy? What brings you happiness? What's the most, important lesson you learned in life so far? So when they started this protocol, they found out that when people started to reflect on their life and remember, who they were, the life they lived, they were able to gain a new insight. They were able to find closure and revisit things that maybe they needed to address again. And after they did this life review and they wrote down what they said and read it back to them, that it actually not only made people feel better, but it decreased their pain and it decreased their anxiety. And think about people who are chronically or terminally ill, how much fear can be involved in that depending on their belief system and where they are, right? You asked me earlier, like what tools do you see people, how did you see people coping? So people who were actually absolutely terrified and filled with anxiety, when they do this legacy therapy protocol, it decreases their fear, it decreases their anxiety, it decreases their pain, and it allows them to gain new perspective of their life. So they actually maintain their dignity, and they understand that no matter what happens, they are always in charge at the end of the day.
I'm hearing, at least in part, that the legacy work allows someone to realize that their story is not just a story of present suffering, but it's been a story of a lifetime, however long they've lived, of ups and downs, successes and failures, relationships, thereby takes them out of their suffering for a moment, because they realize their story is bigger than that and greater than that. And they have an opportunity to revisit moments they're proud of, to remember things they worked through that were hard, to remember ways in which they blessed other people. Often with my clients and with myself, I encourage them to remember how far they've come, and not just as a nice sort of, yeah, you've come a long way, but to get really specific about, remember how far you've come. Let's go back. Let's start walking backwards and considering the triumphs you've had, the hard times you've worked through, the family situation that you survived, the relationship that you mended, the promotion that you got, the way you helped your kids. And it's remarkable. And this isn't in the midst of death and dying, but people's suffering is real to them nonetheless. And when people are really stuck and really in pain in the moment, it can feel like that's all there is. But if we can just open up our picture a little bit and open up our eyes and view the rest of our life and our story, we begin to regain a sense of ourself and our value and our significance in the world. And it sounds very, very much, very similar to what's happening with the legacy work that you're mentioning when someone is encountering their mortality.
Exactly. And I think that's so wonderful that you're doing that with your clients, because that story it's so important, because it allows people to understand and tap into what their legacy is specifically, because there's so many different types of legacy. You've got, well, this is my financial legacy, this is my will and trust, but there's also about the legacy, our complementary legacies, like how we build into other people, the different hats that we wear as a profession, or a father or a mother or a child, and talking about each one of those complementary legacies and how those legacies affected so many other lives. Because for me anyway, if unless I go back to remember, like, I'm going to forget it. I'm going to forget about the patient that I took care of, or one of the kids I coached in Little League. I need to be reminded, because I'm human, unless it's right there. If I have a thank you card, I can look back and grab some thank you cards, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I made an impact on somebody. But many of us don't have those thank you cards and those pieces of valid information to remind us of how each one of us is so special and unique, and how we affect each other. We profoundly, even like walking down the street, picking something up that somebody dropped, and you give that to them. Any act of kindness is part of your legacy. And it's such a beautiful way to remember your story and think about how we all help each other out and we all link together.
It's one of the casualties of modern mankind, in my estimation, is that way back in history, oral tradition was passed on around the campfire, or whatever form a community would have, and the kids would learn from an early age about the generations that went before them, and learn about the significance of their generation, how they were carrying on a legacy from one generation to the next, and how important it was for them to rise to that occasion. And immediately you can understand how they would begin to be filled with a sense of who they were and their purpose in life, and why it mattered that they lived well, and why their life mattered, period. And I haven't run any research on this, but it just seems from even a casual review of society and culture these days that our sense of connection to our own stories within our own family line and to the larger story of humanity has been lost. And when those threads are severed, I think it causes a lot of pain, a lot of disconnection, and a lot of isolation and disorientation. And the reality that this legacy work, even just doing a little bit of that, begins to relieve actual physical and mental suffering in the midst of dying, tells us how critical it is that we begin to learn to be reconnected with our own stories and our place within this larger story of humanity that we're a part of.
Absolutely. The generational roots, it's so powerful to feel that, I belong to the collective of my family. And I was very blessed because I grew up 2 doors down from my grandparents, and my grandmother had 12 brothers and sisters, and everybody lived in the same hometown. And they were all buried in the cemetery behind my house. But every afternoon, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 would stroll by, and I was hooked on the stories. I would sit there like 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 in the afternoons in the summer and just be mesmerized listening to these stories of, making it through the Great Depression, and, or just the pranks that they would play on each other. And it's so grounding, and it filled me up, and now that I created a site where people can tell their stories and share that. It's so rich, right? That's such a gift to give your children.
Reminds me, every summer for almost 50 years, almost every summer for about 50 years on my dad's side of the family, we've gone to a beach in North Carolina it becomes basically a family reunion. And inevitably, 1 or 2 times during that week, there were 4 brothers. One of them has died tragically at the beach in a sailing accident. So now that there are 3 of them left, but when there were 4, and now that there are 3, inevitably still, there's some sort of storytelling time comes about where they regale us all with stories of being brothers in Greensboro, North Carolina back in the 50s and 60s, and the mischief they would get into. And that has been a tremendously valuable and precious part of my life. Just
hearing those stories from the brothers as they talk about them, and then hearing all of the wives react, roll their eyes, and all the stuff that the spouses do when they hear all of the men regaling the family with stories. And so I've been fortunate to have sort of a campfire experience in that regard, where I have some sense of where I've come from. And my dad has gotten really interested in genealogy and has done a ton of work just to help the whole family appreciate where we've come from, and when did we arrive over here on this continent, and all those kinds of things. And it's really rich and useful work and really meaningful to me. I'm curious, we're going to dive into talking about the work you've done on legacy as a result of becoming aware of how powerful legacy is with your patients. I'm first curious, though, to know, what have you observed has changed in your husband now that he's in remission? He's not encountering mortality the way that he once was, but he certainly did. What's different about him?
Everything. And I'm speaking for him. So this is just, what I've noticed. From a physical perspective, he works out almost every single day. And he worked out before, but it's different now. Like, he's very aware of, what he eats and his exercise regime and things like that. So that really made a profound effect on him. But overall, I think he's happier. And if there's any, issues that he has to face emotionally, he heads straight through it. Like, instead of just, waiting for not doing anything and then letting something build up and then it would bother him in the past, now he's more open to, we need to talk about this. And let's get through this and move to the next step. What's the solution? So that's a really noticeable change. He's more tolerant. He's more patient on all different levels, professionally, personally, and he wants to give back. He's very into helping others. And I think that's a very common thing that happens when somebody has this death experience or they realize their mortality, that it's all about helping others and giving back, because that's how you keep it. You got to give it to keep it. He's really transformed in that way.
Very cool. And the episode just before yours with Alison Zimmerman, her father died after a really grueling glioblastoma battle. And that's the one string on her banjo after that experience with him is service. And in particular, using her experience and her story in service to other people. So just even anecdotally, in the space of 2 conversations, that very thing has emerged. How have you changed as a result of going through this with your husband?
Well, on different levels, I guess it was another opportunity for me to experience loss, because I didn't know if he was going to live or die. And because I lost so many people in my life, I become triggered with abandonment issues when I feel like somebody I love is going to die. And it allowed me to heal on another level, to know that, I could lose him, and I could lose him any day, not just from leukemia, but anybody could die. We never know when that's going to happen, as you're aware. And really just to be grateful in the moment and know that, when I take it at the end of the day, again, it's not about the destination, it's the journey, that I'm grateful that I even have a relationship with him, that he's my husband. There's so much to be grateful for. And I wouldn't trade that dance for anything. Even if he would have died of the disease, I would have loved to have been Jeff Gannon's wife, because I love him. And that was one of the best experiences and journeys in my life. So professionally, it gave me an opportunity, again, to help others and to try to create a footprint. So anybody that shows up at the bedside has an algorithm or a process in place where they can help someone regain their dignity and relieve their anxiety at whatever stage of life they're in. And that's huge. That's the biggest gift I can ever think of. It's so meaningful to walk a journey with a patient, but it's more meaningful to help my colleagues, because there's so many people, people Most people who are in healthcare do it because they have a heart for it and they want to do the next best thing. And to be able to leave a tool behind that's proven to increase quality of life, that's a gift. And it's a career ender for me. It's like, ooh, okay, I did it.
Because you're now out of the clinical world and you have given yourself completely to developing a new resource. And this is a great time to just turn the corner and talk about that. What is Haven? Why did you make it? What does it do? How can it help us?
Haven is an end-of-life care platform. It's rooted in clinical research called legacy therapy that's proven to increase quality of life. So I put my nursing cap on and thought, took on the attitude of a clinical nurse specialist and thought, I want to create something that's going to work for anybody who's sick or healthy. And so I integrated that clinical research into it. So it's a tool that healthcare providers can work, end-of-life doulas can use it while they're working with patients. And it essentially just allows people to create their legacy by doing a life review. And that's where the clinical research is integrated. And there's different ways that people can create their legacy on Haven. So it's a digital platform. So it's not going to get ruined if, you spill a cup of coffee on it. It's always going to be there. It's permanent. They can do a life review. They can touch on all the different things in their life that they would like to write about. So it really puts people in the driver's seat and allows them to choose what their legacy is going to look like for them. With the website, there's different features where you can upload photos, as many photos as you want. We're adding videos. And there's a beautiful and heartwarming feature with legacy letters. So people can write special, meaningful letters to people that they love, now, and they can choose to share that with them now and send those letters. It's a legacy letter, or they can create letters that can be sent out after they die.
Wow.
The platform has a lot of different features. It's not just for palliative care or end-of-life doulas to use. It's for anybody like you, Andrew, like your father. If he wants to write his legacy, he can go to the website and create his legacy and then choose who we'd like to share it with. So again, it's like, remember, we're empowering people during end of life because we know it's hard in our society, as you're well aware, for people to even wrap their hands around death and dying. It's the elephant in the room. It's happening everywhere around me, but it's not going to happen to me. And this is a gentle, easy way for people to take a step back and kind of look at their mortality and start to embrace it. Because I think a lot of us in this end-of-life ecosystem, we're challenged by how our society is still so repelled by the concept of death and dying. And, people even, they're just like, well, it's not called passing away. They die. They don't pass away, and we shouldn't sugarcoat it. And my thinking is, they're going to get there eventually. So, let's have them create their legacy, and then they're going to get a new perspective on their mortality. We don't have to get in their face and say, you're going to die someday, because a lot of people, it's just going to make it creates more anxiety and they become even more frightened.
Little bits of exposure incrementally over time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How can we find Haven?
The landing page is HVN. So Haven, hvnlegacy.com.
And anybody can use it. It's not just for medical professionals, palliative care, or doulas. Anyone can use it. Great.
Anyone can use it.
Well, and hats off to you, because it's one thing to have an idea. It's another thing to translate that idea into a functional product and service like you have. And you alone know what that's taken. So thank you for the blood, sweat, and tears that undoubtedly have gone into it. And it's turned into, your life's work, at least in this chapter. And undoubtedly, as you continue to do this work, you'll be led to greater levels of discovery about what you're here to do. And so hats off to you, too, for having the courage to take your experience and your passion and convert it into something that is useful to others, of service to others. And I'm sure it wasn't easy to leave the profession you'd known for 25 years in that way. You were making a big change, and you did it. So thank you for your example and for providing the service.
You're welcome.
I want to circle all the way back as we begin to land the plane to your time as a clinical nurse specialist and Bonnie Ware, the nurse who wrote the 5 Regrets of the Dying. Are you familiar with that, Top 5 Regrets of the Dying?
I'm not.
She's an Australian nurse, and I've come across it, and she has a book to that effect, Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. I was curious if there were a handful of regrets that you saw pop up the most among people that were dying in your care that you'd be able to share with us.
Wow. I would think the biggest one is lack of closure, of telling people. Cleaning up unfinished business was huge. And the more people died better deaths when they were able to say the things that had never been said or re-say things that needed to be said again. I think that's a lot of the regrets. Other regrets that my patients had, that we talked about, just regrets over choices that they made and finding acceptance over the choices that they didn't make, and then where they were now and thinking about, well, how does this affect me now? Because I probably should have done this, but I didn't.
So regret over choices of actions they decided to take and the consequences, or didn't take?
Or didn't take, not in regard to their healing pathway, but it was just more when they were thinking back about their life.
A mix of regret over things they did and things they didn't do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I'm hearing that, and that's a theme that we hear often in these conversations, and I'm taking that to heart. Say the things that need to be said. Say the things again that need to be repeated. Have the tough conversation. Take a moment to enjoy your spouse, to enjoy a good friend, rather than just forge ahead into the next thing. And tell you what, this mortality mindset that we're attempting to cultivate on this podcast, it's really hard work to cultivate it, because unless you're actively encountering mortality, there are so many things demanding your attention, calling for your attention, shiny objects out there, that I find the mortality mindset to be a constant tension-filled reality. But I think it's a very healthy tension for us to live in. And I think our conversation today has helped me and will help our listeners continue to cultivate that mortality mindset for themselves. Because if we choose, we can hear what you've shared today from your experience, and we can begin to put those things into action in our life right now, in one way today, another way tomorrow. And ultimately, when we die, and that could be sooner rather than later, be able to say that, hey, we gave the best we could. We did the best we could. We gave it the best we had. At least we don't regret having tried to live as well as we could and to die with no regrets. What do you hope we take away from this conversation today? If you could bottle a message or two and we would ingest it precisely as you've given it to us, what might that be?
Well, if something in your life is causing you pain, emotionally, or with anything, like with any relationships or anything like that, don't wait. And if you need help, to try to address these issues, reach out and find the help, because we could die tomorrow. Like, there's so much freedom and empowerment in facing something head on and not look at it from above or looking at it from below, but just going straight through. The best way out is through. And that is the most empowering thing that could ever happen for me anyway. With everything in my life I faced, with all the challenges, with my husband's illness, is really just address it, find help, and then go for it, because life is short. It's very, very, it can be gone in the blink of an eye. And there's so many magical moments to have in every single day of our lives, and to waste it, feeling sad or being stuck or being a victim. It's important to me not to, like, that victim mentality mind. I've had that throughout my life. And you know what you get when you sit on the pity potty, Andrew? A big ring around your bottom. That's the only thing you get from it. And I've had that ring, and trust me, it's not comfortable after a while. So just, my advice is, don't wait. Hug your problem and get through it.
Mortality, in reality, is our friend if we're willing to let it be. It's inevitable. And so, relevant to this discussion today, we might as well begin to accept it. And let's do it voluntarily and consciously while we can, so that we're not having to do that when it's forced upon us. And let's let it have its remarkable way with us of helping to clarify for us what matters most. A persistent theme in these conversations has been that new boldness that people find when they've encountered mortality to tackle the tough challenges, to go ahead and, people say, I just dropped all the bullshit. I mean, that's just in various ways across the whole spectrum of these conversations, that theme has been 100% true of everyone that I've talked to, that what matters most rises to the surface and what matters less drops off. And we can do that, listeners, if we're willing to cultivate the mortality mindset and courageously and consciously confront our mortality. Now, short of an encounter with mortality, it requires some effort. And that means things like steady diet of this podcast. It means visiting the graveyard. It means contemplating your mortality. There's a practice among some sect of Buddhist monks, I think, where they actually practice meditating upon their moldering corpse full of worms in the ground to bring it that much to reality. And even as long as I've been doing this kind of work, I still marvel at the fact that my own mortality is still not a reality to me. Mortality is real to me, but my own mortality is still not very real to me. So
why do you think that is?
I think deeply within the human heart is an abhorrence to our mortality. We deeply abhor it. We recoil from it instinctively. And where that comes from, I don't exactly know. So it's a great question. Why? I mean, some people have probably answered it much better than I'm capable of, but I just know that it seems to be the case. I can push myself as far as I can close to it, and still it's like, nah. Nah. But even so, I find that cultivating the mortality mindset is tremendously valuable. It encourages me in the pure sense. It infuses me with courage to do now the things I might be considering putting off, to have the meaningful conversation, to have the hard conversation. One of my guests helped me to really downgrade risk in my life, things that I consider risky. Her story helped me to just automatically downgrade those things by 3 or 4 degrees or 3 or 4 levels. Like, if I think that's risky, she's saying from her vantage point, all the things she thought were risky were not at all. I just kind of downgraded risk, and that's served me tremendously well. So let's keep working at it. This is worthwhile work. And I do want to ask before we sign off, how our listeners can connect with you.
They can connect with me at maggie@hvnlegacy.com or support@hvnlegacy.com, or they can find my profile on LinkedIn.
Awesome. And I'll put all that in the show notes for this episode on the podcast website. And as always, I want to remind us all that you are going to die, but you're not dead yet. So wake up and get after it.
How well acquainted are you with your legacy? In light of your own mortality, what are you willing and able to do differently in order to become better acquainted with it and give the gift of your legacy to those you love? Thanks to Maggie and her Haven team. All you have to do is visit hvnlegacy.com to get started right now. Haven's guided, self-paced process is simple and intuitive and yours to use as you see fit. What you create remains as a permanent record for those you love and those who come after you. It would be much easier not to check out Haven. It would be much easier to enjoy the insights you gained from today's conversation, but do nothing with them in the real world. But if you listen to this podcast, you're not interested in the easy road. You're looking for the narrow road that leads to a life you're outrageously proud of when you die. And you're intentionally tapping into the power of your mortality to motivate you. Visit hvnlegacy.com and start capturing your legacy today. As you capture your legacy on Haven, continue creating your legacy in the Graveyard Group with the support of your very own confidential board of advisors. Harness the power of the mortality mindset to break free from the status quo, become the person you are made to be, and live the life you were made to live with guts, gusto, and abandon. New groups for men and women are forming now. To learn more, visit andrewpettycoach.com to schedule a free 1-hour coaching session with me. Find me on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Andrew Petty Coach, or email me at andrew@andrewpettycoach.com. I'm so glad you tuned in today. Don't forget to follow this show, and I'll see you next time on Andrew Petty is Dying.